The loneliest door I ever walked through was not the door out of a church building, but the one inside myself, where I finally admitted I could no longer believe what everyone I loved still believed. My name is Thomas Avery. I am 74 years old, and for 20 years I sat in a church pew with a faith that was quietly leading me long before I found the courage to leave with it. Want to say at the beginning that this is not a story about anger, though anger passed through it. It is not a story about thinking I became smarter than the people who stayed, because I did not. Some of the kindest people I have ever known are still inside that church, singing the hymns I used to sing and bowing their heads over prayers that once gave shape to my mornings. This is a story about losing something slowly, privately, almost politely, and discovering that the world you built around belief does not always know what to do with you when belief is gone. I did not grow up in that church. That matters, because people sometimes assume faith is something planted in you as a child and either kept or abandoned. For me, it came later. I was 48 when I first walked through the double doors of Grace Fellowship on a rainy Sunday morning, wearing a suit that no longer fit me well, and carrying a grief I did not know how to name. My first wife, Ellen, had died the year before from ovarian cancer, and I had spent 12 months pretending I was managing. I went to work. I paid bills. I called our daughter, Rachel, every Wednesday. I kept the yard trimmed, because neighbors notice when a widower lets weeds climb the fence. But inside the house, when evening came and the refrigerator hummed louder than any human voice, I felt like a man left behind in a room after all the furniture had been removed. A coworker named Martin invited me to church. He had been careful about it, not pushy. He simply said, "Tom, you do not have to be alone every Sunday." That was the sentence that got me. Not God loves you, not Jesus has a plan, not any of the phrases I would later learn to say myself. You do not have to be alone every Sunday. Loneliness can make a man religious before conviction does. I do not say that to insult the faith I found there. I mean, only that need often opens the door before belief walks in. Grace Fellowship was warm in every way and exhausted. Person needs warmth. There was coffee in the lobby, women who remembered your name after hearing it once, men who clapped your shoulder and asked if your car was running all right, children racing down the hall with paper crafts from Sunday school. The sanctuary was plain, with wooden pews and blue carpet, and a small choir that sang slightly off-tempo, but with genuine feeling. I remember standing during the first hymn, not knowing the words, holding the hymnal like a foreign document, and hearing all those voices around me. It had been so long since I had been included in a sound larger than myself that I nearly cried before anyone said anything religious at all. After the service, people gathered around me. That could have felt suffocating, but it did not. It felt like being found. A woman named Ruth brought me a plate from the fellowship lunch, even though I said I was not hungry. An older man named Harold asked what kind of work I did. Pastor Glenn, who was then in his early 50s, shook my hand with both of his and told me he was glad I came. He did not try to fix me. He did not explain Ellen's death. He simply said, "Grief is heavy. Let us help you carry what we can." I went home that day with leftover casserole wrapped in foil, a church bulletin on the passenger seat, and a strange sense that the house was not quite as empty as it had been the night before. Within a year, I was attending every Sunday. Within 2, I was part of a men's Bible study on Wednesday nights. Within 3, I was helping with the building committee, ushering once a month, and showing up early to unfold tables for potlucks. Faith came to me partly through words, yes, but mostly through belonging. I believed because I wanted to believe, and I wanted to believe because belief gave me people who knew where I was on Sunday morning. It gave me a vocabulary for sorrow. It gave me songs for things I had only carried silently. It gave me a way to imagine Ellen some were whole and unharmed. And for a man who had watched illness reduce the woman he loved, that thought was more than comfort. It was air. I remarried at 53. Her name was Carol, a widow from the church with 2 grown sons, and a laugh that made people turn around. We were not young, so our courtship was practical and tender in the way later life love can be. We drank coffee after service, compared notes on grief without making grief the whole conversation, and took walks around the church parking lot because neither of us wanted to seem too eager. Carol believed with an ease I envied. Her faith did not seem to wrestle her. It lived in her like an old song. She prayed naturally, gave generously, and trusted that the Lord was at work in circumstances that would have made me restless with questions. I loved her kindness first, then her steadiness, then the way she made room in her life without making me feel like a replacement for the husband she had lost. When we married, Grace Fellowship filled the reception hall with food. Someone made punch. Someone brought deviled eggs. Ruth cried through the vows. Pastor Glenn spoke about second mercies, and I believed every word because I wanted my life to have become evidence of grace. Carol and I bought a small house 10 minutes from the church, and for many years our life revolved around that community so completely that I hardly noticed where church ended and ordinary life began. Our friends were church friends. Our calendar was church calendar. We brought meals to new mothers, visited hospitals, attended funerals, helped with youth fundraisers, hosted small group, donated to missions, cleaned after holiday services, and prayed before every meal. Even in restaurants, there was beauty in it. I will not pretend there was not. I have seen church people arrive in the middle of a crisis with casseroles, chainsaws, cash, babysitting, and quiet competence. I have watched old women sit with dying neighbors so family members could sleep. I have watched men who could barely speak about feelings build wheelchair ramps in the rain because love needed lumber more than vocabulary. I have watched teenagers return from mission trips more serious about the suffering of other people. I have watched a whole room sing over a family whose son had died, not because singing solved anything, but because sorrow sometimes needs witnesses with voices. For a long while, that was enough. Or perhaps I did not yet know it was not enough. The first doubts did not arrive like rebellion. They were small discomforts I folded and put away. A sermon about suffering that seemed too neat. A prayer request where gossip wore a holy coat. A young woman in the congregation who divorced a cruel husband and was treated with more suspicion than the husband had ever received. A visiting speaker who spoke about people outside the faith with a contempt I could not reconcile with love. I noticed these things, but noticing is not the same as questioning the foundation. Every family has flaws, I told myself. Every church is full of imperfect people. I had said those words to others, and they were true as far as they went. But some true words can also become covers you pull over problems you do not want to face. My daughter, Rachel, was never as comfortable in the church as I was. She lived 3 hours away by then, teaching art at a community college, and she visited often enough to know the names of people, but not enough to belong. She was polite during services, respectful to Carol, kind to the women who asked when she would have children, though I could see the tightness around her mouth when they did. One Sunday after lunch, when she was about 30, she asked me if I really believed that everyone outside our faith was lost in the way Pastor Glenn had described that morning. I gave the answer I had learned to give. I said God was just and merciful, and we could trust him with what we did not understand. Rachel looked at me and said, "That is not really an answer, Dad." I felt defensive. I said some things were beyond us. She said, "Maybe, but I think sometimes people call something a mystery because the answer would make them uncomfortable." I was hurt by that, not because she had insulted me, but because she had touched a place I was already guarding. I told Carol about it later, expecting comfort. Carol said gently, "Rachel has always needed room to ask." That irritated me too. I did not want room. I wanted certainty to remain where I had placed it that by my late 50s. I had become one of the dependable men of the church. Not a leader exactly, though I served as a deacon for several years, but someone people trusted to show up. If a pipe burst, they called me. If a widow needed leaves raked, they called me. If chairs needed arranging, if the sound system failed, if the church fan would not start, my phone rang. I liked being needed. There is a particular satisfaction in being useful among people who praise usefulness as service. It made me feel humble and important at the same time, which is a dangerous combination. Yet as my role grew, so did my unease. Behind the scenes, church was not only hymns and mercy. It was politics, preferences, egos, money decisions, hurt feelings, and careful language. People argued over music while calling it discernment. They resisted helping certain families because the families were complicated. They spoke of love, but sometimes meant control. I include myself in this. I was not above it. I sat in meetings where we talked about people as problems to manage rather than souls to understand. I nodded along when I should have asked harder questions. Belonging can make cowards of decent people, especially when the cost of honesty is losing the room. Still, I stayed. I stayed because Carol loved the church. I stayed because Pastor Glenn had buried Ellen and married me to Carol. I stayed because Ruth brought soup when I had pneumonia. I stayed because Harold and I had breakfast every first Saturday. I stayed because my grandchildren knew the Christmas pageant. I stayed because leaving would have required explaining something I barely understood myself. It is easy to criticize someone for staying too long in a place they no longer fully trust. It is harder to understand that a church can be not only a belief system, but a neighborhood, a family album, a support structure, a map of where to go when someone dies. The deeper doubts began after a boy named Caleb died. He was 16, the son of a couple in our congregation, killed in a car accident on a wet road after a football game. I had known him since he was a toddler. He had once hidden under the refreshment table during vacation Bible school, refusing to come out until I promised him 2 cookies. His funeral filled the sanctuary beyond capacity. Young people stood along the walls, stunned by mortality, before they had words for it. Pastor Glenn preached gently, but there were phrases I could no longer receive. God's plan. Called home. We may not understand now. I watched Caleb's mother sitting in the front row, making a sound I had heard only once before, when Ellen was in pain near the end, and I thought, if there is a plan in this, I do not know how to praise it. That thought frightened me. It felt disloyal, not only to God but to everyone around me. When the congregation sang, I moved my lips but did not sing. I looked at the stained glass cross above the platform and waited for the old certainty to return. It did not. What returned instead was the memory of all the times I had offered tidy words to grieving people, because tidy words protected me from the helplessness of sitting with them. After Caleb's death, prayer changed for me. I still bowed my head. I still said the words at meals. I still prayed aloud when asked, because by then I knew the language well. But private prayer became strained. I would begin, "Lord," and then stop. I did not know who I was addressing. I did not know whether silence meant patience, absence, mystery, or my own inability to hear. I read books defending faith, and books questioning it, then books warning against the books questioning it. I listened to sermons on doubt. I underlined passages. I asked Pastor Glenn for coffee and told him carefully that I was struggling. He was kind. He told me doubt could be part of faith. He told me to stay close to Scripture, close to the body, close to prayer. He said isolation was dangerous. I knew he meant well, but I felt the trap in the advice. If doubt led me away from the very structures meant to resolve doubt, then any movement outward would be seen as proof of danger. For years, I lived in 2 rooms. In one room, I was Thomas Avery, faithful church member, husband of Carol, deacon, usher, man who prayed before potluck meals. In the other room, private and locked, I was a man sitting at the kitchen table after Carol went to bed, reading, thinking, feeling the old beams of belief creak above him. I did not tell Carol how far the doubts had gone. That is one of my regrets. I told myself I was protecting her. Maybe partly I was, but I was also protecting myself from the look I feared seeing in her eyes. Disappointment, confusion, maybe even pity. When the person you love shares your faith, losing that faith can feel like beginning a betrayal before you have committed any visible act. Carol noticed anyway. Of course she did. Wives notice the prayers you stop saying with your whole voice. She asked me once, while we were washing dishes, "Tom, are you angry with God?" I nearly said no, because no was easier. Then I said, "I don't know if anger is the word." She dried a plate slowly. "What is the word?" she asked. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard and said, "Tired, maybe." She nodded, but her face had changed. It was not anger. It was fear. Faith had held Carol through the death of her first husband, through illness, through raising sons alone, through every disappointment she had survived. For me to say I was tired of it was, to her, like saying I was tired of air, that she prayed for me more after that. I would find her Bible open on the table, a note with my name on it tucked between pages. She invited me to join devotionals. She asked if I wanted to meet with Pastor Glenn again. I sometimes did, sometimes did not. I began to feel watched, though no one meant harm. A doubting person in a believing community becomes both loved and monitored. People ask how you are doing with a certain softness that makes honesty difficult. If you say, "Better," they are relieved. If you say, "I no longer know what I believe," the room changes. I was 63 when I first admitted to myself that I no longer believed in the way the church required. I did not say I believed nothing. I still felt wonder. I still felt moral seriousness. I still felt moved by kindness, by beauty, by the mystery of consciousness, and the ache of love. But the doctrines had begun to feel like clothes from another season, familiar but no longer fitting my body. I could recite them. I could explain them. I could even defend them if someone pushed me, because old training stays in the hands. But I could not honestly say I trusted them. And yet I stayed another 11 years. Some people may judge that. I judge it myself sometimes. But leaving a church after 20 years is not like canceling a membership. It is more like removing a thread from a garment and watching half your life loosen around it. Carol would have been hurt. My friends would have been confused. My identity would have become uncertain. Where would I go on Sunday mornings? Who would know when I was sick? Who would bring soup? Whose funerals would I attend? And would they want me there? Would the people who called me brother still call me that if I no longer shared the family name? So I became skilled at partial participation. I sang the hymns that still moved me and stayed quiet during the ones that did not. I served on practical committees, but avoided doctrinal discussions. I bowed my head during prayers and let the words pass over me like weather. I told myself that belonging mattered more than agreement, and in some ways that is true. Communities should have room for honest struggle. But my struggle had become secrecy, and secrecy changes the taste of everything. Each Sunday, I shook hands and smiled and felt, somewhere under my ribs, the exhaustion of being translated into a version of myself others could still recognize. Carol grew ill when I was 68. Heart trouble first, then complications from surgery, then a long narrowing of what she could do. Our church surrounded us beautifully. I will never deny that. Women brought meals. Men repaired the porch railing. Pastor Glenn visited. Ruth sat with Carol while I went to appointments of my own. If love is measured in practical faithfulness, then Grace Fellowship loved as well. That made my unbelief harder, not easier. People imagine hypocrisy as hiding among cruel people while pretending to agree with them. But sometimes hypocrisy feels like being loved by people whose deepest explanation for love you no longer share, and not knowing how to receive the gift without lying about the wrapping. Carol and I had our hardest conversations 6 months before she died. She was in her recliner, a blanket over her knees, breathing carefully. I had been reading in the chair beside her, though I do not remember the book. She said, "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." I closed the book. She looked frail by then, but her eyes were clear. "Do you still believe?" she asked. I had spent years preparing for that question, and was completely unprepared when it came. I wanted to ask what she meant by believe. I wanted to say I was struggling. I wanted to give some careful, merciful half-answer. But she had asked for the truth, and dying people deserve truth as much as they deserve gentleness. I said, "Not the way I used to. Maybe not the way you mean." She closed her eyes. I thought she might weep. Instead, she said, "How long?" I said, "A long time." That hurt her more than the unbelief, I think. The length of my silence. She turned her face toward the window. "I wish you had trusted me with it," she said. I said, "I was afraid." She said, "Of me?" I said, "Of losing you inside it." She reached for my hand then. Her hand was thin and cool, but her grip was still Carol's. She said, "You should have let me decide whether I would be lost." I have carried that sentence ever since. Love cannot protect itself by withholding the truth. It only builds walls and calls them shelter. Carol did not stop loving me. She did not scold me. She did ask whether I still believed we would see each other again. That question broke my heart because I could not give the answer she needed with honesty. I said, "I hope love is not wasted." She smiled sadly and said, "That sounds like you." Then she squeezed my hand and said, "I will believe enough for both of us for now." That was Carol, not because she was simple, not because she did not understand the difficulty, but because her faith remained her home, and even while dying, she wanted to leave a light on for me. After she died, the church did what churches do best. They arrived. They carried chairs, made coffee, printed programs, lined up food, sang her favorite hymns. Pastor Glenn preached from the Psalms. I sat in the front pew beside Rachel and Carol's sons, listening to people speak of heaven with confidence, and I felt two griefs at once. I grieved my wife, the woman who had come into my middle age like sunlight through a side window. And I grieved that I could not stand fully inside the hope that comforted everyone around me. When people said, "You'll see her again," I nodded because correcting them would have been cruel, but each nod felt like another small departure. Widowhood made leaving possible and more terrible. Possible because Carol was no longer there to be wounded by my absence from church. Terrible because the church became even more important after she died. Those people were the ones who knew her. They remembered her laugh, her lemon cake, her way of raising one eyebrow when someone bragged too much. If I left, I would not only lose religious community, I would lose the last public place where Carol's name still circulated naturally. For a year after her funeral, I kept attending. I sat in our pew, third row from the back on the left, though I now sat alone. People hugged me. They asked if I was eating. Ruth brought soup again, because some ministries become lifelong habits. Harold took me to breakfast. Pastor Glenn checked on me. I was grateful, truly grateful, and also increasingly unable to pretend. Sermons that once comforted me now passed through a filter I could not remove. I heard certainty where I longed for humility. I heard answers where I felt silence deserved respect. I heard us and them too often. Some Sundays I left with a headache from holding my face in the proper expression. The final break came quietly. No scandal, no argument, no dramatic confrontation. Pastor Glenn preached a sermon about wandering from truth. It was not aimed at me. I know that. But as he spoke about people who leave because they love the world more than God, I felt something settle in me. Not anger exactly. Weariness. I thought of my years of prayer, reading, fear, grief, service, silence, and loneliness. I thought, if I leave, this is the story they will tell about me, because it is the only story their framework allows. That I was tempted, proud, wounded, deceived, careless, rebellious. Not that I had tried to stay long after belief had gone. Not that leaving would cost me nearly everyone. Not that I had remained partly because I loved them. I went home, hung my suit jacket in the closet, and knew I could not go back the next Sunday. So I did not dot at first. People assumed I was unwell. I was 73 by then, and age provides convenient explanations. Ruth called. Harold called. Pastor Glenn called. I said I needed some time. That was true, but incomplete. After 3 weeks, Pastor Glenn asked if he could visit. I agreed. He sat in my living room, where Carol's photograph still stood on the mantel. He looked older than he had when I first met him, which startled me, as if I had expected only myself to age. We talked about Carol, about my health, about loneliness. Then he asked, "Tom, is this about your doubts?" I said, "It is about my honesty." He nodded slowly. "Where has your honesty brought you?" I looked at my hands. I had rehearsed many versions of that answer, but in the moment I said, "Outside, I think." His face tightened, not with anger, but grief. That almost undid me. I would have preferred anger. Anger creates distance. Grief reaches. He said, "Outside the church or outside faith?" I said, "I do not know where one ends and the other begins anymore." We spoke for nearly 2 hours. He was kinder than some would have been. He did not threaten me. He did not call me names. He did ask whether I had been reading the wrong voices. He did warn me against isolation. He did say the enemy uses grief. I knew he meant the devil. I heard concern, but I also heard the old frame closing around me, turning my inner life into a battleground where any conclusion outside the church had to be explained by danger. When he left, he hugged me and said he loved me. I believe he did. That is what made the door closing behind him so painful. News traveled as it does. Not maliciously at first. Prayer requests, concern, careful conversations. I received calls and notes. Some were tender. Some were frightened. Some were arguments disguised as invitations. People sent books, sermons, and handwritten verses. One man I had served beside for years asked if there was hidden sin in my life, because he could not imagine another reason for unbelief. A woman told me Carol would be heartbroken, which was cruel, even if she thought it was loving. Harold took it the hardest. At breakfast, he stared into his coffee and said, "I do not understand how a man can walk with us 20 years and then say he was never one of us." I told him I had been one of them. That was the point. He shook his head. "Not if you leave," he said. That sentence marked the loss more clearly than any doctrine could. Not if you leave. I had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that friendship might survive the change because surely 20 years of shared meals, repairs, hospital visits, jokes, funerals, and ordinary affection counted for something beyond agreement. Some friendships did survive, but were altered. Ruth still called, though less often, and she always sounded sad. Pastor Glenn sent a birthday card. A younger man named Joel met me for coffee twice and talked to me like I was still a person rather than a cautionary tale. But many people disappeared, not in one dramatic wave, but through the slow erosion of invitations no longer extended, updates no longer shared, casual contact no longer natural. I had left the building, but I had also left the calendar. That may sound small until you have lived inside a calendar for 20 years. Sunday mornings were the worst. The first few felt like playing hooky for my own life. I woke at the usual time, shaved, made coffee, and then had nowhere to go. The silence was not peaceful. It was accusing. At 9:30, I knew they would be gathering in the lobby. At 9:45, the choir would be practicing. At 10 o'clock, the first hymn would begin. I could picture Ruth in her usual seat, Harold near the aisle, Pastor Glenn stepping up to the pulpit, the sound of Bibles opening, the rustle of bulletins. I had thought I was leaving beliefs, but on Sunday mornings, I understood I had left sounds, smells, habits, handshakes, the old woman who kept mints in her purse, the child who waved at me from 2 rows ahead, the familiar stain on the carpet near the communion table. I tried other things. I walked in the park, but the families there made me feel more alone. I visited a Unitarian church once, and people were kind, but I felt like a widower on a first date, comparing every gesture to the marriage I had lost. I went to a lecture at the library on local history. I joined a senior exercise class and hated every minute until I began to like it slightly. I had coffee with Rachel when she visited, and she listened without trying to turn my story into triumph. She said, "Dad, I'm glad you are being honest, but I'm sorry it cost you so much." That sentence was one of the few that did not ask me to be anything other than what I was. The loneliness of leaving a faith community is particular because much of the world does not know how to recognize it. If your spouse dies, people understand grief, though imperfectly. If you move away, people understand homesickness. If you lose a job, people understand disorientation. But if you leave a church because belief has left you, some people think you are finally free and expect you to celebrate, while others think you have ruined yourself and expect you to repent. Very few understand that you may feel both relieved and bereaved, that you may no longer believe the songs and still miss singing them, that you may disagree with the sermon and still miss the voice that preached your wife's funeral, that you may be unable to return and still feel, for a long time, like a man standing outside his own house in the rain, "I missed being known." That is the plainest way to say it. At church, people knew the dates of my losses, the kind of pie Carol used to make, that my knee hurt in cold weather, that I preferred black coffee, that I had once repaired the nursery sink at midnight before Easter service. Outside, I was just an old man in a grocery store, an old man at the library, an old man walking carefully over wet pavement. Community gives weight to a life by letting details accumulate in other people. When that community falls away, you discover how much of your identity was stored in their remembering. For several months, I wondered if I should go back and simply keep quiet. Many people do. I understand them. Do not judge them too quickly. There are elderly people in pews all over this country who no longer believe every word, perhaps not even most of the words. But church is where their dead are remembered, where their friends sit, where someone will notice if they miss 2 Sundays in a row. Belonging is not a small thing at 74. It can be the difference between being ill for 3 days and being found on the 4th. It can be the difference between a funeral with stories and a funeral with strangers. But each time I imagined returning, I felt my body resist. I had spent too many years making myself smaller for the comfort of others. Not maliciously, not dramatically, but steadily. I had edited my questions, softened my answers, hid my reading, disguised my silence as reverence. I could not spend the last part of my life performing certainty for access to affection. That may sound noble now, but it did not feel noble. It felt like choosing hunger, because the only available meal made me sick. I began writing letters I did not send. One to Carol, telling her I was sorry I had hidden so much, and that I missed her faith even though I could not make it mine. One to Harold, telling him I had not faked our friendship, that every breakfast had been real, that unbelief did not erase the morning we repaired his fence after the storm. One to Pastor Glenn, thanking him for kindness while admitting the language he used for my leaving made me feel less like a man and more like a warning. One to my younger self, the widower who walked into grace, fellowship soaked with rain and grief, telling him that he had not been foolish to go in. He needed shelter. He found it. Shelter can save you for a season and still not be the place where you die. That realization softened something in me. For a while after leaving, I wanted to sort the whole experience into good or bad because ambiguity was exhausting. I wanted to say the church had saved me or harmed me, that faith had been true or false, that the people had loved me or abandoned me. But life resisted those categories. Grace Fellowship had given me friendship, purpose, language, meals, comfort, and a second marriage. It had also taught me to distrust parts of myself, to fear questions, to confuse conformity with peace, and to call loneliness faithfulness. Both were true. The human heart is large enough to hold gratitude and grief without forcing one to cancel the other. At 74, I live more quietly now. Rachel calls on Sundays because she knows they are hard, though I tell her she does not have to. I have 2 friends from the exercise class, both widowers, neither particularly religious, and we meet for coffee on Thursday mornings. They do not know the old church stories unless I tell them, and sometimes I do. Joel still meets me every month or 2, and we speak carefully but honestly. He remains in the church. I remain outside. We have learned not to make each conversation a trial. Ruth sends a Christmas card with a verse inside. I keep it on the mantel near Carol's photograph, not because the verse comforts me in the old way, but because Ruth's handwriting does. I do not know exactly what I believe now. That answer disappoints people on both sides. Some want me to declare myself free of all religion, as if certainty in the opposite direction would prove courage. Others want me to say I am on my way back, as if uncertainty is only a hallway leading to their door. But I have grown suspicious of forced clarity. I believe love matters. I believe cruelty damages the soul, whether or not you define soul the way I once did. I believe grief deserves presence more than explanation. I believe communities should make room for honest questions without treating every question as infection. I believe people can leave and still love what they left. I believe some departures are acts of integrity and still feel like exile. There are nights when I miss prayer. Not the duty of it, not the feeling that I had to say the right words to remain faithful, but the old sense of placing my worry somewhere larger than my own mind. Now, when I sit with fear, I sometimes speak into the room anyway. I do not know whether anyone hears. Perhaps that means I am still religious in some quiet, broken way. Perhaps it means I am human. I speak to Carol, too. I tell her about Rachel, about the weather, about the church people whose names still come to me in the grocery aisle. I tell her I am sorry. I tell her I am trying to live honestly. If there is a heaven and she can hear me, she knows. If there is not, then the speaking is still a form of love continuing. A few weeks ago, I drove past Grace Fellowship. I had not planned to stop, but my hands turned the wheel before my mind objected. It was late afternoon, and the parking lot was mostly empty. The maple tree near the entrance had grown taller, and the sign had been repainted. I sat in my car across the street and watched a young mother carry a sleeping child through the side door, probably for some weekday program. For a moment, I remembered myself at 48, wet from rain, walking into that building because I could not bear one more Sunday alone. I wanted to reach back to him. I wanted to say, "This place will hold you, and one day it will hurt you, and both things will be true." I wanted to say, "Do not confuse being held with being owned." I wanted to say, "When the time comes, tell Carol sooner." I did not go inside. I sat for a few minutes, then drove home. That may sound sad to you, and perhaps it is, but it did not feel only sad. It felt like visiting a childhood house after strangers have moved in. You can love the porch, remember the rooms, and still know your key no longer fits. I am learning to accept that not every place that shaped me can continue receiving me. Some homes are temporary, even when we spend decades mistaking them for forever. If you are listening to this and you are inside a community you no longer fully believe in, I will not tell you to leave. I will not tell you to stay. People who speak too easily about another person's cost have usually not paid it themselves. I will only ask you to be honest about what the silence is doing to you. There is a silence that protects tender things until they are ready to speak, and there is a silence that slowly teaches you your real self is unwelcome. Learn the difference if you can. It may take years. It took me nearly half the remainder of my life. If you are someone who loves a person who has left or is leaving, try not to turn them too quickly into a lesson. Do not assume they wanted an easier life. Leaving can be the hardest thing a faithful person ever does, even if the faith itself has changed or disappeared. Ask what they miss. Ask what they still love. Ask what became impossible. You do not have to agree with them to refuse making them a stranger. Some of the loneliest people in the world are not those who have no community, but those who had one and then became unacceptable to a dot. And if you are older, as I am, and you fear it is too late to tell the truth about your own life, I understand that fear. The older you get, the more every change feels like it should have happened years ago. You think of all the Sundays, all the words spoken with a closed throat, all the chances to be honest that passed while you were being careful. But late honesty is not nothing. It may not restore what silence cost. It may not keep everyone beside you. It may not give you a new community quickly, or at all. But it can give you back the sound of your own voice. I spent 20 years in a church I no longer believe in, and leaving was the loneliest thing I ever did. Yet I do not hate the years I spent there. I buried a wife with those people. I found another wife among them. I learned service, received kindness, made mistakes, hid too much, loved deeply, and left slowly. That is not a clean story, but most true stories are not clean. They have fingerprints on every page. Now, when Sunday morning comes, I make coffee and open the curtains. Sometimes I walk. Sometimes Rachel calls. Sometimes I sit quietly and let the old hymns rise in memory without asking myself whether I believe every line. They were part of me once. Some parts remain. Some have fallen away. I am still here, in this strange open space after certainty, learning that loneliness can be honest, that grief can contain gratitude, and that leaving a place does not mean it never sheltered you. Maybe that is what I want you to hear most. A person can change and still be worthy of tenderness. A person can lose faith and still love truth. A person can walk out of a church alone and still carry within him every hand that ever helped him stand. And sometimes the most painful departure is not the moment you leave the people you loved, but the moment you stop abandoning yourself in order to stay.